August 10th, 1944. The air above the barracks hung thick with heat and silence. Outside cicadas cried in the pine woods beyond the wire, their song rising and falling like distant sirens. Inside, 20 women sat pressed against the walls, too afraid to speak. The light bulbs flickered, washing their faces in a pale, uneasy glow. Somewhere down the corridor, a heavy metal door groaned, and the sound rolled through the hall like thunder. Boots followed measured, deliberate echoing on the wooden floorboards. Every heartbeat seemed to count the steps coming closer. They had been told this moment would come. For weeks, the whispers had filled the camp, rumors carried from one trembling mouth to another. The Americans will punish us. They will make us pay. None of them truly knew what awaited behind that door. Some had been nurses, others clerks or radio operators, but all had worn the same uniform and carried the same guilt of defeat. Their hands, once steady in war, now trembled over nothing. A few crossed themselves. Others stared at the floor, jaws clenched, as if bracing for a blow. The door swung open. The sound of iron against iron cut the air. The guards entered, young men, faces shadowed beneath their caps. The women held their breath. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the soldiers stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with something small and shining in his hand. A thin glint of silver foil caught the light. The women froze. In that instant, every warning, every nightmare they had believed began to unravel. What came next was not punishment but confusion, not cruelty but a kindness too strange to understand. And in that uneasy kindness, a fracture opened between what they had been told and what they now began to see. For a long moment after the door closed, silence filled the barracks again. The sound of boots had faded down the corridor, leaving only the dull hum of the ceiling light and the shallow, uneven breathing of the women. No one spoke. They sat frozen, the taste of sweetness still lingering faintly on their tongues, the silver wrappers glinting like strange relics on their knees. What had just happened seemed impossible. They had prepared for humiliation, for pain, for vengeance, yet what came through that door had been none of those things. It was a small gesture, absurdly gentle in a place meant for punishment. But that very gentleness unsettled them more than cruelty ever could. Liesel, the nurse, with pale hair and a hollow look in her eyes, stared at the chocolate in her hand until it began to melt. She whispered almost to herself. They smiled. Her voice cracked on the last word, as if the thought itself hurt. A few of the others turned toward her but said nothing. In the stillness, the realization began to seep in, slow and heavy. Everything they had been told about their captors, every warning, every hateful story was starting to crumble. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief. The guards brought food at regular hours, real meals, not the scraps they had imagined. Bread soft enough to tear apart with their fingers, meat that filled the air with a smell so rich it made them dizzy. The women hesitated each time, expecting the kindness to end, expecting the trick to reveal itself. Yet it never did. Each day passed like the one before, quiet, orderly, predictable. There were no insults, no jeers, no raised hands. Only the weight of confusion pressing harder with every act of decency. At night, lying on their bunks, they whispered the same question over and over, why none of them could find an answer. The Reich had painted America as a land of chaos, of decadence, of brutality, masked by fake smiles. Yet here behind barbed wire the world seemed reversed. The enemy was calm, patient, even awkward, in his attempts at kindness. That contradiction gnawed at them. It stripped away the certainty that had once held them upright, leaving them adrift in doubt. Memories of capture returned like old wounds that refused to close. In North Africa, they had watched the desert swallow. Their comrades had seen columns of smoke rise over fields of wreckage. The propaganda officers had told them capture was worse than death, that any woman who fell into Allied hands would lose her honor and her life. When the surrender came, some had tried to hide in the ruins. Others had burned their uniforms, hoping to erase the proof of their service. But escape was impossible. They were rounded up with the wounded, and the dying herded together like shadows of the army that once claimed invincibility. In the first days of captivity, they had seen their own soldiers spit at them, calling them cowards for surviving. That shame cut deeper than any enemy blow. It followed them across the sea, clinging to their thoughts during the long voyage through the Atlantic storms. Even now, in the still air of Louisiana, they could feel the ghost of that accusation. The kindness of the guards only made the guilt worse. It was easier to hate a tormentor than to face compassion from one's enemy. The women avoided looking at the soldiers when they came. They kept their eyes down, hands folded, voices low. Yet curiosity crept in through the cracks of fear. When the guards spoke to each other in English, some of the women listened closely, trying to catch familiar words. A few recognized fragments from their school lessons: coffee, breakfast, cleanup. The sound of the language, soft and fluid, carried no menace. It was strange, almost tender. Liesel began to write again. She had kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of her coat since Tunisia. At first, her entries were short, almost mechanical. The guards brought bread today. No one was hit. We are alive. But as the days passed, her handwriting grew slower, her sentences longer. The Americans are not what we were told. They speak kindly even when they do not understand us. One of them gave me an apple. I thanked him, but he only nodded, as if embarrassed. Her words carried both gratitude and dread, as though kindness itself were dangerous to believe in. Outside the barracks, the sounds of the camp began to form a rhythm: the clank of mess tins, the murmur of distant conversation, the occasional laugh. That laughter unsettled them most. It sounded free, careless, as if war were a story that had already ended. The women could not join in. Their world had not ended. It had collapsed. Every day behind the wire reminded them that they were no longer part of the nation they had once served, yet not fully part of this strange new order either. They existed between two realities belonging to neither. Sometimes, when the guards escorted them to the yard for air, they saw the male prisoners working in the distance. The men looked stronger, sunburned, busy with shovels and wheelbarrows. They sang sometimes German songs, rough and loud, echoing across the fields. Hearing those melodies brought tears and anger all at once. The women envied their defiance. For them, defiance had turned inward, silent and slow. One evening, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. The wind rattled the barrack walls, and rain hammered the tin roof until it sounded like machine gun fire. In the flicker of lightning, the women huddled together, trembling not from fear of the storm, but from the memories it stirred. The noise reminded them of nights spent under bombardment, of hospitals shaking under falling bombs, of men crying out for morphine that never came. Yet here, even as thunder roared, the guards walked the perimeter calmly, rain dripping from their helmets. No one shouted, no one hid. The storm passed, and for the first time, they realized they were not afraid of the night. Days turned into weeks. The women began to notice small things: the way the guards greeted each other with casual warmth, the way they treated wounds without hesitation, the way they shared cigarettes among themselves, and sometimes with the prisoners. The simple normality of it all was disarming. It hinted at a kind of life they had never known, a life without slogans, without constant fear, without the need to prove loyalty through suffering. But guilt shadowed every new realization. When they thought of home, the images came in fragments: cities burning, families, starving children, hiding in cellars. They imagined their mothers queuing for bread, their brothers fighting on fronts already lost. To be fed while their homeland starved felt like betrayal. The abundance around them, once terrifying, now filled them with shame. They began to eat less, to save scraps of bread in secret, as if hoarding guilt itself. At night, Liesel's notebook filled with contradictions. "We are treated humanely," she wrote, "but I cannot forgive myself for surviving. I cannot understand how kindness can feel heavier than cruelty." Other women echoed her unease in whispers. They had spent years believing that endurance meant righteousness, that hardship was proof of purity. Now, faced with a world where comfort and mercy coexisted with power, their moral compass spun without direction. One morning, the guards brought letters, printed forms from the Red Cross allowing prisoners to write home. The women stared at the blank spaces where they were meant to describe their condition. What could they write? That they were safe, that they were cared for, that the enemy had been gentle. The truth felt unspeakable, almost dangerous. Some left the paper empty. Others wrote carefully neutral words. "I am healthy. Do not worry. Yet even these phrases carried a quiet trembling, as though the truth might be read between the lines. As autumn crept closer, the air grew cooler, and the fields beyond the fence turned gold with dying grass. The women watched the horizon through the wire, wondering what else had changed beyond it. They had entered captivity as believers in a cause certain of their country's destiny. Now, belief had thinned into silence. Doubt had replaced devotion, but doubt brought no peace. It was a new kind of imprisonment, one that no fence could contain. Sometimes at dusk, the sky over the camp filled with the sound of distant trains. The whistle would rise long and mournful, fading into the trees. The women would fall quiet listening. None of them said it aloud, but each thought the same thing somewhere, that sound meant movement toward home, toward freedom, toward something they could no longer name. The chocolate had melted long ago, but its sweetness lingered like a ghost, reminding them of that first impossible moment when the world they knew began to dissolve. They did not yet understand it, but the breaking had begun. The morning they were told to pack what little they owned. The women thought it was another transfer, another move from one camp to another, another reshuffling of captives. The guards spoke softly, almost apologetic, pointing toward the waiting trucks that rumbled outside the gate. The air smelled of wet soil and pine resin after a night of rain. The barracks, which had become a fragile kind of shelter, looked smaller than ever as they stepped out into the light. Each carried a bundle, a coat, a scarf, a notebook, a keepsake folded in cloth. They had learned not to ask where they were going. Questions in war or captivity were useless. But the air that morning felt different, unsettled, as though something unseen waited beyond the horizon. The trucks rolled slowly through the Louisiana backroads, passing rows of cypress trees and stretches of open fields. For the first time in months, there were no fences, no towers, no shouted orders, yet none of them felt free. Their eyes followed the telephone wires that stretched endlessly along the roadside, symbols of a world still connected while theirs had been cut apart. The road was smooth, the bridges solid, the farms wide and green. America unfolded before them like a quiet contradiction, vast, intact, untouched by the ruin that had consumed Europe. The women sat in silence, clutching their bundles, each lost in the same uneasy thought. If this was the land of the enemy, then everything they had been told was a lie. When they reached the rail station, the sight of the train stunned them. It was no freight car, no wooden wagon, reeking of straw and oil. The cars were clean painted in deep green and silver, the windows clear, the seats padded. A faint hum of air moved through the cabins, an unfamiliar coolness that made them shiver even in summer heat. The guards gestured politely, helping them aboard as though they were travelers, not prisoners. Liesel hesitated before stepping inside, her hand grazing the polished metal of the door. She had seen trains in Germany, yes, but never like this. Not even officers had ridden in such comfort. As the train began to move, a low murmur filled the car. The sound of steel against steel was steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. Outside the window, the countryside blurred into an endless patchwork of green and gold. Villages passed small houses with white fences, children chasing dogs in front yards, women hanging laundry that fluttered in the wind. None of them seemed afraid. None of them seemed hungry. That sight alone unsettled the women more than any weapon could. War had devoured their homeland. Yet here the world seemed untouched. One of the younger women, Marta, pressed her forehead to the glass. Her eyes followed a line of cars on a nearby road, hundreds of them glinting in the sunday. She whispered, "Everyone has one." Her voice carried a note of disbelief, not envy, but quiet defeat. Liesel didn't answer. She couldn't. The image was too large to hold, too far from everything she knew. The train stopped briefly at a junction where rows of American soldiers stood waiting to board another line heading east. They laughed, smoking cigarettes, slapping each other on the shoulders. Their uniforms were worn but clean, their faces tanned, their posture relaxed. There was no despair, no desperation. Some of them noticed the German women through the windows and waved casually without mockery or malice. The women turned away, ashamed of their reflex to expect cruelty. One of them began to cry quietly, not from fear, but from something harder, to name a grief born of recognition. As the journey continued north, the landscape shifted. The humid air gave way to drier winds. Pine forests turned into farmlands that stretched endlessly, dotted with red barns and grazing cattle. The abundance was relentless. Every mile was proof of a power they had never imagined, a country that produced more than it could ever need, that fought a world war and still fed its people well. They passed factories where smoke rose from tall chimneys, but even that smoke looked different, white, clean, organized. No ruins, no rubble, no shattered glass. Liesel wrote again in her notebook. "The earth here is alive," she scribbled, "as if war has never touched it. In Germany, the fields are bones." Her hand trembled as she wrote the next line. "We were told they were dying, but we are the ones who are ghosts." At mealtime, the guards opened the dining car. The women stepped inside hesitantly, expecting rations or tin plates. Instead, they found tables covered with clean cloth cups of hot coffee bowls of soup. The smell of roasted meat filled the air. The guards watched them quietly, offering no words. The women ate slowly, ashamed of their hunger, glancing at one another as if to ask permission to finish. Some could not swallow, others wiped tears without meaning to. The taste of food was almost unbearable. It felt like mercy they hadn't earned. Later that evening, when the train stopped again to refuel, the guards allowed them to step out for air. The platform was alive, with motion workers hauling crates, engines rumbling, cranes lifting cargo into waiting trucks. The noise, the order, the sheer scale of it all was overwhelming. For years, they had heard Berlin's radio boast that America was a weak and divided land drowning in its own greed. Yet here, in every movement of every machine, they saw the opposite efficiency. Without oppression, strength, without fear. One of the guards, a young man with a southern drawl, tried to speak to them through broken German. "Safe," he said, pointing at the horizon. "No bombs here." His attempt at kindness left them speechless. Safe, a word they had almost forgotten. Liesel nodded, unsure whether to smile or cry. The man offered her a cigarette. She took it, hands trembling, though she didn't smoke. When he turned away, she stared at the unlit cigarette for a long time, as though it were something sacred. As night fell, the train crossed into Virginia. The windows reflected the faint glow of cities in the distance, strings of electric light that shimmered like stars brought down to earth. The women stared in silence, transfixed. Electricity that never failed. Light that burned through the night it seemed impossible. At home, the cities were blacked out, the power rationed, the sky filled with fear. Here, the darkness itself seemed powerless. The contrast cut deep. When they finally reached the port at Norfolk, dawn was breaking. Mist hung low over the water, and the faint sound of ship horns echoed through the air. As the women stepped off the train, they froze. Before them rose an industrial city unlike anything they had seen. Docks stretching for miles, cranes moving in perfect rhythm, ships lined in rows, their steel hulls glinting in the morning. Sunday. It was a cathedral of machinery. Every direction spoke of abundance. Grain vehicles, barrels, boxes, endless supplies, flowing like rivers of steel and energy. The women stood motionless, overwhelmed. In that moment, they realized the scale of their own ignorance. They had been told America was decadent, disorganized, dependent on Jewish financiers and black laborers. Yet here, the unity of movement, the harmony of work, refuted every word of propaganda they had swallowed for years. They watched men and women, white and black, working side by side, laughing, shouting instructions, moving with the confidence of those who feared nothing. For the first time, a feeling close to admiration pierced through their fear. It frightened them more than hatred ever had. To respect one's enemy was to admit weakness, and yet they could not deny what they saw. Liesel wrote again that night as they were processed through the port offices. "We thought ourselves chosen," she wrote, "but here I see no chosen people, only those who build and share. We were told they were soft, but their softness hides a strength far greater than ours." When they were led to the waiting trucks that would take them inland, the women no longer whispered. They sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes hollow but alert. The rumble of the engines vibrated beneath their feet, carrying them away from the sea deeper into a land that seemed to have no end. Some looked out the windows, trying to memorize every detail, the fields, the roads, the faces of children on bicycles. It was not curiosity now, but mourning for a vision of the world that had died without a single shot fired. In the distance, the rising sun painted the clouds in gold and crimson. The women shielded their eyes, unused to the brightness. For them, morning had long meant sirens and smoke. Yet here the light came without fear. It was a gentle thing, ordinary and devastating. As the trucks moved toward the horizon, they felt the weight of what they were leaving behind. Not Germany, not the war, but the certainty that had once been their armor. The world had opened vast and indifferent, and they were unprepared for its truth. The convoy rolled westward through the wide highways of Virginia, and what the women saw outside the truck windows began to erode the last remnants of their certainty. The road stretched endlessly smooth as glass flanked by fields that shimmered under the morning sunday. Towns appeared and vanished like dreams, each with clean streets, houses painted in white and pale blue gardens in bloom, even in the middle of war. There were no ruins, no soldiers marching through rubble, no faces hollowed by hunger. America seemed untouched not only by bombs, but by despair itself. The sight filled them with a strange, aching confusion. They were supposed to hate this place, to see it as a decaying land of chaos and greed. Yet the laughter of children playing in front yards sounded clearer, more alive than anything they remembered from home. Liesel kept her eyes on the horizon, hands folded tightly on her lap. The motion of the truck made her stomach twist, but it was not the movement that unsettled her. It was what she was seeing. Power lines ran along every road, humming faintly. Cars moved in steady lines, not military convoys, but ordinary people driving to work. And at every intersection there were signs of abundance, markets open, produce piled high, neon letters glowing in daylight. She felt as if she were crossing into another century. When they stopped for a brief rest at a small-town depot, the air smelled of coffee and bread. Across the street stood a diner with a wide glass window. Inside, a waitress laughed as she poured coffee for a group of factory workers. Liesel could not look away. The scene was so simple, so ordinary, and yet it struck her with unbearable force. Ordinary was what the world had lost, and here it was still alive. She thought of her mother, standing in line for rationed sugar in a bombed-out Berlin, and something inside her began to break. The journey continued, and the deeper they moved into the American heartland, the stronger the sense of contradiction grew. Everywhere they looked, there was motion tractors tilling vast fields, freight trains cutting through plains, rivers lined with barges heavy with cargo. It was a country in full stride, a nation that fought without slowing down. Even the smallest towns had electricity paved, roads, schools with playgrounds, hospitals with polished windows. The women sat in silence, their earlier defiance shrinking into something fragile and uncertain. At last, they reached a large military installation on the outskirts of Texas. The camp stood in perfect order, rows of barracks, workshops, and fields stretching toward the horizon. Beyond the wire fences, American soldiers moved with quiet precision, their uniforms pressed, their boots polished, their voices calm. There was discipline here, but not the kind they knew. It was a discipline born of confidence, not fear. The guards spoke respectfully even to one another, and no shouting was needed to keep order. The women used to the rigid hierarchies of the Reich could not comprehend it. How could a nation function when its soldiers did not fear their superiors? The intake process was meticulous but impersonal. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and given identification cards. Doctors examined them, nurses took notes, and translators explained procedures in careful German. There was no shouting, no humiliation, only efficiency. One of the female doctors, an American with dark hair tied neatly beneath her cap, asked Liesel whether she had suffered any illness during the voyage. The question was spoken with such ordinary kindness that Liesel hesitated to answer. She did not understand how to respond to civility from the enemy. "No," she finally whispered. The doctor smiled faintly, nodded, and wrote it down. That smile lingered in Liesel's memory long after the examination ended. That evening, the women were led into their new quarters. The barracks were wooden but solid, each with beds arranged neatly, blankets folded at the foot, and electric lamps on the walls. Electricity always there, never failing. When Lisel pressed the switch, the light filled the room instantly, bright and unwavering. She felt tears sting her eyes. Back home, the cities were dark by order, blacked out for fear of bombers. Here, light was constant, casual, a thing no one feared to waste. In the days that followed, the women were introduced to the routines of the camp. Meals were served on time, plentiful and balanced. There was milk, eggs, butter, coffee, things they hadn't seen in years. At first, they could not eat without guilt. Each bite seemed stolen from someone else. But the abundance was impossible to deny. Every morning the smell of bread baking filled the air. Every evening they heard laughter drifting from the guards' quarters, music from a radio-soft melodic nothing, like the martial marches of home. Swing jazz voices singing of love instead of victory. It made them ache in ways they could not explain. The propaganda that had once shaped their entire world began to falter. They had believed America was soulless, ruled by greed and corruption. Yet here they saw order without brutality, strength without fear, prosperity without propaganda. It was not perfection, but it was undeniably alive. The realization frightened them. To admit that their enemy's world was freer and kinder than their own was to betray everything they had been raised to believe. One afternoon, the guards escorted them to work detail at a nearby warehouse. Inside, crates of food, clothing, and medical supplies were stacked to the ceiling. The women stood speechless before the mountain of abundance. Flour, sugar, canned fruit, cigarettes, enough to feed an army. One guard noticed their stunned expressions and said simply, "This is just for one base." The words hit like a blow. Just for one base. The scale of it was incomprehensible. Lisel's hands shook as she lifted a box labeled milk powder. In Germany, milk was a luxury. Here it was stored by the ton. She thought of her younger brother, pale and coughing in a cold apartment back in Cologne, and her heart twisted painfully. "They have too much," she murmured. "We have nothing." That night she wrote again in her notebook. "I saw a warehouse full of food," she wrote. "More than we could dream of." It felt like standing before a God we were told did not exist. They create plenty without sacrifice, and we worshipped sacrifice as virtue. How could we have been so blind? The other women shared the same quiet turmoil. In whispered conversations, they compared what they saw with what they had been told. "They are not weak," one said. "They are not decadent." Another answered, "Then, what are we?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Weeks passed, and the women began to notice subtler differences, the way American soldiers joked with each other, the lack of rigid titles, the small gestures of equality. They saw black soldiers among the ranks, something that would have been unthinkable under their flag. They expected to see cruelty, yet saw cooperation instead. When one of the black cooks offered them extra bread during lunch, some hesitated to take it. Not from pride, but from shame. It was as though the world itself had turned upside down. Slowly their thoughts began to shift from fear to reflection. The enemy they had imagined was not a monster, but something far more disarming, ordinary, flawed, but generous in ways that defied logic. The realization hurt because it demanded humility. To recognize humanity in the enemy was to confront their own dehumanization. One evening, the guards organized a small outdoor movie for the prisoners, a gesture meant to boost morale. The women gathered hesitantly, unsure what to expect. The film was a newsreel followed by a comedy. On the screen, American soldiers danced, sang, and stumbled through laughter. The audience around them, guards and prisoners alike, laughed openly. The sound of shared laughter echoed across the camp, mingling in the night air. For the first time, Lisel laughed too. The moment felt forbidden yet freeing. She covered her mouth, but the smile stayed. When the film ended, the projector flickered off and darkness returned. The stars above the camp seemed closer than ever, vast and indifferent. Liesel sat still for a long time, her heart heavy with conflicting truths. She whispered to herself, "If they can be like this, what have we been fighting for?" That question haunted her long after. It haunted them all. It was the first time they understood that their captivity was not merely physical. It was ideological, spiritual. The walls around them were made of wire, but the real prison was what they had carried inside: the fear, the arrogance, the blindness. And as the lights of the camp burned through the night steady and warm, something inside each of them began to tremble, not from despair, but from the slow, painful birth of understanding. They had come face to face with the truth, and it was merciful, terrifying, and impossible to unsee. Winter crept in quietly that year, softening the air around the camp and cloaking the pines in silver mist. The women could feel the change before they saw it. The mornings colder, the nights longer, the distant sound of wind slipping through the wire fences like a ghost. They had been in captivity for months now, and though they still called themselves prisoners, the fear that had once lived in every breath had begun to fade into something quieter, harder to name. Life had taken on a strange rhythm: work, meals, sleep, silence. Yet beneath the routine, something was shifting. The world they thought they knew was crumbling in their minds piece by piece, replaced by questions they dared not voice. It began, as it often did in this strange place, with something small. One morning, Lae'zel was assigned to help in the camp infirmary, a simple wooden building that smelled of antiseptic and soap. She expected little, perhaps menial chores, cleaning floors, folding linens. But when she entered, the first thing she saw made her stop. On one of the beds lay a wounded American soldier, his leg bandaged thickly, his face pale with fever. A nurse, a woman from Kansas, her accent slow and musical, was tending to him. When the nurse saw Lae'zel, she smiled and handed her a basin of water. "Can you hold this?" she asked gently. Lae'zel froze. She had tended to German soldiers, once young men, who had called her angel as she wrapped their wounds in the heat of battle. But this was different. This was the enemy, the man her country had told her to despise, the man whose comrades had burned her homeland. Her first instinct was to pull away, yet the nurse's calm voice left no room for hesitation. "He's burning up," she said softly. "We just need to cool him down." Without knowing why, Lae'zel obeyed. She dipped the cloth into the basin and pressed it against the man's forehead. His skin was hot, his breath shallow. He did not stir. She looked down at his face, expecting hatred, but found only exhaustion, the same kind she had seen in her own brothers before they died. Something inside her cracked then, as if the walls she had built around her heart were too thin to hold. She didn't speak. She simply kept pressing the cloth to his skin, over and over, until the trembling in her hands stopped. That night she could not sleep. The memory of the soldier's face followed her into the dark. She realized with a sudden, unbearable clarity that she had felt no hatred, only sorrow, and that frightened her more than any act of cruelty could have. For years she had believed that compassion was weakness, that mercy was reserved for the victors. Yet here she was, finding peace in the simple act of care, and it made her feel both guilty and alive. Days passed. The camp prepared for Christmas. The guards hung lanterns near the mess hall, and a tree was brought in from a nearby forest, its branches still dusted with frost. The women watched in silence as the soldiers decorated it with paper stars and small candles. None of them expected to be included. Yet on Christmas Eve, something extraordinary happened. The camp gates opened to a group of local townspeople, women, children, even church choirs carrying boxes wrapped in brown paper. They had come to deliver gifts to the prisoners. At first, the women refused to believe it. Gifts. For them, it had to be a mistake. But one by one, the boxes were placed into their hands. Inside were small things: soap handkerchiefs, candies, a few wool gloves, and folded notes written in careful German. "Frohe Weihnachten," they said. "We wish you peace." For a moment, the world stopped. Some of the women clutched the boxes to their chests, as if afraid they would vanish. Others wept openly, unable to contain the flood of emotion. Lae'zel sat on her bunk, staring at the bar of soap in her lap, her fingers tracing the English letters embossed across it. She thought of the bombed hospitals where she had once scrubbed with water rationed by the cup of the soldiers who died without morphine or clean hands. The soap was not just a gift, it was a revelation. These people, their supposed enemies, were capable of generosity, even when they had no reason to be. Later that night, the choir began to sing outside the barracks. Their voices rose through the cold air, soft, clear, unbroken. The women listened in stunned silence as the familiar melody drifted through the wire. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The same carol they had sung back home in candlelit churches, now sung by strangers who had every right to despise them. Tears slid down faces that had forgotten how to cry. For a moment the camp was no longer a prison but a sanctuary, and the distance between captor and captive dissolved into something wordless and holy. Liesl stepped outside, drawn by the sound. She saw one of the guards standing nearby, holding a lantern. He noticed her and nodded, gesturing toward the singers beyond the fence. "They came for you," he said quietly. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. "For all of you." She wanted to ask why. Why show kindness to those who had brought so much pain? But the question died before it reached her lips. She knew the answer would be too simple, too painful, because mercy was stronger than hate. When the song ended, the guards handed out mugs of hot cocoa steaming in the night air. The women drank slowly, their hands trembling. The taste was sweet, unreal. Liesl felt warmth spread through her chest and into the hollow spaces that had ached for so long. It wasn't the drink, it was the kindness, the impossible kindness, that had crossed every barrier of language and war. In the days that followed, something unspoken changed among them. The women smiled more easily, even at the guards. The fear that had once defined their existence no longer ruled them. Instead, there was a quiet awareness, a fragile peace that came from seeing their enemies as human. Yet this awakening carried its own pain. The guilt of understanding was heavier than the ignorance that had come before. They began to see themselves clearly, and it was unbearable. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the Red Cross announcing that Germany was on the brink of defeat. The women gathered around as the interpreter read the words aloud. No one cheered, no one spoke. There was only the rustle of paper and the faint sound of wind outside. Liesl felt her throat tighten. She had imagined this moment countless times, the end of the war, the collapse of everything she had once believed in. But now that it had come, there was no satisfaction, only sorrow. That evening she returned to the infirmary. The American soldier she had once cared for was sitting up, now pale but smiling faintly. When he saw her, he nodded. "You helped," he said slowly, his German awkward but sincere. "Danke." The word, simple and clumsy, pierced her heart. She tried to reply, but no sound came. Instead, she reached for his hand, briefly, gently, then pulled away. In that moment she understood that the war was over, not on paper, not by treaties, but inside her. The hatred that had fueled her nation's march across the world had finally run dry. That night, the snow began to fall, thin and hesitant. The flakes melted on the window glass, leaving small rivers of light. The women lay awake in their bunks, listening to the quiet. Beyond the fences, the guards kept watch, their silhouettes still and patient beneath the lanterns. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang midnight. Liesl opened her notebook one last time. Her handwriting was unsteady, but her words were clear. "We were told mercy was weakness, but tonight mercy conquered us all. They broke our walls without firing a shot. We will never see the world the same way again." She closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest. The cold air seeped through the cracks in the walls, but it no longer felt cruel. It felt like something alive, something that reminded her she was still human. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and soft, erasing the footprints in the dirt. And for the first time since the war began, the world felt clean again. Spring returned slowly, cautious and pale, as if the earth itself were still afraid to breathe. The war had ended months before. Yet in the camp, the air remained heavy with unspoken things, memories that had nowhere to go, hearts that had not yet learned how to hope. The barbed wire still gleamed in the sunlight, but it no longer felt like a cage. It was a reminder, quiet and thin, that boundaries could hold bodies but never the slow turning of the mind. For the women who had lived through that winter of revelation, life began again in small, hesitant gestures. A smile shared at breakfast, a song hummed under breath, a letter written not in fear, but in longing. Liesl often stood by the fence in the early mornings, watching the sky change from gray to gold. The guards no longer barked orders. They nodded to her, now sometimes even waved. The bitterness that once sat like a stone in her chest had softened into something quieter, something she could not yet name. The war had taken everything: faith, homeland, purpose. But it had left her a fragile understanding of what it meant to be human. Stripped of symbols and flags, the camp had transformed. What was once a holding ground for the defeated had become a place of slow, deliberate learning. Classrooms were set up in the recreation hall. American officers and visiting professors gave lessons in English geography literature. Books were handed out, translations of Whitman, Steinbeck, and Emerson, and the women devoured them hungrily. They learned words that had no German equivalent: freedom, dignity, conscience. The irony was not lost on them that they had to come to their enemy's land to discover the language of their own liberation. Liesl spent her afternoons helping in the camp's small library. The shelves were lined with books in both languages donated by local communities. One day she found a thin volume of poetry tucked between manuals and reports. On the first page was written, "To whoever finds this, remember that even the defeated can choose to be kind." The handwriting was elegant looping. She read the line again and again until it blurred. The other women changed too. The defiance that had once defined them, the pride of the Reich, the quiet superiority, had dissolved into humility. They began to see beauty in the simplest acts: the smell of bread baking, the hum of electric light, the freedom to speak without fear. Even their laughter changed. It was no longer sharp or nervous, but soft, unguarded. They were no longer living against something. They were living within, something new, something gentler. Yet the awareness of home haunted them. Letters arrived from Germany, written on brittle paper stained with smoke. Cities in ruins, families scattered, hunger everywhere. The contrast was unbearable. Here the land overflowed. There people starved. Some women wept when they read the news. Others refused to open the envelopes at all. Liesl did both. She read, then folded the letters carefully and placed them inside her notebook, beside her earlier entries, the ones filled with confusion, guilt, and awakening. Those pages had once been her confession. Now they were her proof that change was possible. In the evenings when the work was done, the camp's lights glowed softly across the fields. Music drifted from the loudspeakers, songs of peace, of homecoming, of spring. The women gathered outside, sitting on the steps of their barracks, their faces lit by the warm bulbs that never flickered. They talked about the future in hesitant phrases. What would they do when they were sent home? Who would they be in a country that had burned its own soul? No one had answers, only the shared understanding that they could never return unchanged. One afternoon, the camp received visitors from the nearby town, families who had sent Christmas gifts months before. Among them was a woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She recognized Liesl immediately. She had been one of the choir singers that cold December night. The woman handed her a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a knitted scarf, soft and pale blue. Attached was a note. "You reminded me that kindness has no side in war." Liesl could not speak. She held the scarf to her chest, feeling its warmth, its absurd and perfect humanity. As spring turned to summer, the orders came at last. The prisoners would be repatriated. The announcement was met not with cheers, but with a hush. A collective breath caught between joy and sorrow. Going home no longer meant what it once had. Home was rubble, uncertainty, memory. The life they had built here in captivity had become a strange kind of refuge, one where they had rediscovered their worth not through power but through grace. On the morning of departure, the women dressed in their plain camp clothes, carrying small bundles. The guards lined the road not as wardens but as farewells. Some shook hands, others saluted. Liesl searched the crowd and found the nurse from the infirmary. The woman smiled the same quiet smile that had once disarmed her completely. "Take care," she said softly. "You're free now." Liesl wanted to say something, thank you or goodbye, but no words felt large enough. She nodded, eyes glistening, and turned toward the trucks, waiting beyond the gate. The engine started rumbling low like a heartbeat. As the convoy pulled away, she looked back one last time. The camp receded into the distance, small and shimmering. Under the morning Sunday, the fences that had once defined her world now seemed fragile, almost delicate. They held nothing anymore. The journey across the Atlantic was quieter this time. No fear, no sickness, no guards standing stiff at every corner. The women stood on deck as the coastline faded, the wind cold against their faces. The ocean stretched endless and gray, yet it felt less like a prison and more like a bridge. A vast living reminder that the world was larger than nations, larger than hate. Liesel leaned against the rail and closed her eyes. The hum of the engines mixed with the sound of waves, and for the first time in years she felt something close to peace. When they reached Germany, silence met them. The ports were ruins, the streets were rubble. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, years old, but unforgotten. Families stood among the wreckage, searching for faces that would never return. The women walked through the devastation, like ghosts returning from another planet. Children stared at them, clean, well-fed, wearing coats that did not hang in tatters, and the shame was unbearable. Liesel returned to Cologne to find her home gone, her mother's apartment reduced to a shell of brick and ash. She stood among the debris, the scarf from the American woman still wrapped around her neck. Her neighbors eyed her with suspicion, murmuring about collaboration, about survival. She did not defend herself. There was nothing to defend. The only thing she carried from captivity was a truth too simple and too immense to explain, that kindness had saved her more completely than the Reich had ever promised to. In time, she began to work at a local hospital, helping rebuild what little remained. Medicine arrived from abroad, donations from the same nation that had once been her enemy. Every vial, every bandage felt like a miracle. When the first shipment of penicillin arrived, she held the small glass bottle up to the light and whispered, "I have seen this before." Years passed. The memory of the camp stayed with her, not as trauma, but as an awakening. She kept her notebook, its pages worn and yellowed, the ink faded in places where tears had fallen. On the last page, she added one more line. "They taught me that mercy is not a weakness, but a kind of victory." And when she grew old, she told her grandchildren stories not of battles or flags, but of light that never flickered, of bread that never ran out of a night, when enemies sang the same song under falling snow. Sometimes, when the evening wind rustled through the trees, she would close her eyes and remember the camp lights glowing softly in the distance, the sound of laughter mingling with the faint hum of electricity, and she would feel that same ache, the one that lived between sorrow and gratitude. The war had taken much, but it had given her this, the knowledge that the strongest walls are not built of stone, and that sometimes the heart must break before it can understand. And so her story ended not with victory or defeat, but with something quieter, something more enduring, a fragile human truth that mercy once given never truly ends. It lives on, passed from one trembling hand to another, like light through the darkness. Years later, when time had softened the sharp edges of memory, Liesel would still remember the sound of that door opening, the echo of boots, the silver glint of chocolate, and the quiet confusion that changed everything. What began as fear had ended as understanding, and what was meant to break her had instead awakened something unshakable. In the ruins of war, she had discovered a truth far more enduring than victory or defeat, that humanity, when freely given, carries the power to rebuild even what hatred has burned to ash. She lived long enough to see her country rise again, not through conquest, but through cooperation, through the slow work of learning what freedom truly meant. The camp in Louisiana was gone by then, swallowed by time and trees, yet she carried it with her always, not as a place of humiliation, but of rebirth. It was there behind fences meant to contain her that she had first understood the meaning of dignity. Not the kind demanded by ideology, but the kind restored by kindness. When people asked about her captivity, she would pause before answering. Most expected tales of cruelty, of hunger, of despair. Instead, she spoke of the shock of abundance of lights that never went out of strangers who shared their food and their songs. "They conquered us," she would say softly, not with force, but with mercy. And each time she said the words, she felt their weight settle deeper, as if they were not only her story, but a lesson written for every generation that followed. In the final years of her life, Liesel kept her old notebook by her bedside. The pages had yellowed, the ink had faded, but the words remained. "We were told mercy was weakness, but mercy was what set us free. On the day she died, the window beside her bed was open, and sunlight fell across those fragile pages. The war was long over, yet its quietest victory, the victory of compassion over hate, still shone there, steady and unextinguished, like the light that once burned through the nights of her captivity.